This story is from when I was around 17, but it still makes me uneasy when I think about it. So back in May 2016, I started riding my mountain bike a lot more. Riding around the streets became boring, so I decided to try biking on a trail through the woods. After looking into a few places, I decided Lee Woods was the best option. It was only a couple of miles from where I stayed, so the bike ride there was short and enjoyable. As I arrived, the surroundings felt calm and quiet. For a woodland area in England, especially near Bristol, it was truly breathtaking. When I entered the woods, I noticed signs with different colors at the start of each trail. I think they showed how hard the trails were for bikers and how long they were for walkers, but I'm not sure about that part. I decided to try a trail with a color on it. I think it was blue, but I don't remember clearly. It was fun, so I decided to try the harder trail. But that's when things started to feel strange. I started feeling a bit weird, like the woods were swallowing me. Everything seemed to grow larger and move further away. I tried to ignore it, but I realized I had lost track of time and got lost on the trail. Usually I'm very aware of my surroundings, but this time felt different. Then I came to an odd open area with two paths. One went left, which seemed like the way out, and the other went right, leading deeper into the woods. But then I found a strange, narrow trail that felt unsafe. Even though my gut told me to turn back, I decided to go down it. After a while, the trail became too rough and bumpy, making it hard to even walk. That's when I decided to turn back. But before I did, I stood there for a few minutes, staring down the trail without knowing why. I started feeling like I was being watched from every direction, even though it didn't make sense for so many eyes to be around me in that area. Feeling uneasy, I got nervous and began walking back up the hill, since I was too tired to ride my bike. Just so you know, my bike tires were in perfect condition. No punctures, no slow leaks, nothing wrong at all. But when I got back to the spot where I first entered the trail, that strange feeling of losing time happened again. But this time it felt darker, like something bad was about to happen. Keep in mind, I hadn't seen anyone at all since I started on the first trail. Let me describe the scene. It was a long path with a slightly steep hill on my left and a narrow river on my right, about 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep. And on the other side of the river, there were bushes and a few trees here and there. As I walked about a quarter of the way up the sloping path, I suddenly heard a woman crying behind a tree up ahead. I slowed down, trying to see who was behind the tree, but I kept wondering, why would someone cross the river just to cry there? I moved closer to the river to check and see if the person was okay. I was hoping to help the person, but as you might have guessed, no one was there and the crying stopped. Feeling uneasy, I slowly turned away and started walking again. This time a little faster because I felt nervous. I've had strange experiences before, but they usually happened in houses or buildings, not out in the woods. So this was something new for me. As I was walking, I suddenly got a shiver, and about a minute later, not far from where I had heard the crying, it started again. But this time, the crying was right across the river from me. I didn't stop to look. I started jogging. As I got faster, I heard the bushes rustling, like something or someone was following me. And the crying got louder and more frantic. Keep in mind, my bike was fine before all this happened. As I went to hop on my bike, the rush of adrenaline made me stop suddenly. I looked down, and to my shock, my back tire was completely flat. I checked it quickly, but there was no time to fix it. With no other choice, I grabbed my bike and started sprinting, holding it in front of me. My heart was racing, and I just kept hoping I wouldn't trip or have to drop the bike to run faster. Every step felt heavy, and the whole time, I could still hear that crying getting louder in the distance. With the crying still close behind me and keeping up, I ran faster and faster, just praying to get off the path. I felt like crying because I couldn't do anything to help or escape faster. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes, I finally saw the car park. The crying had stopped following me and started moving back toward where I first heard it. I sprinted into the car park, feeling like I was about to collapse. I must have looked really pale and was breathing heavily, causing several people in the car park to stare at me like I was crazy. I saw the exit sign and ran toward it. As I got closer, I noticed my bike seemed to be moving much smoother. I couldn't believe it, but my bike tire was fully inflated again, just like it was before all the strange crying happened. I quickly jumped on my bike and rode away from Lee Woods as fast as I could. Three years ago, when I was around 15, something unusual happened in my village. It's not a story I share often, because most people think I'm making it up. But lately I've been thinking about it a lot, and I feel like it's time to tell it. My village is in a quiet, rural area, surrounded by forest, rivers, and wildlife. The government protects the area because, for the past 30 years, it has been called a natural paradise. So, exploring this area is hard now because cutting down trees is not allowed, and the forest is really very big. I was spending my summer there, and my favorite activity was hiking. However, I had never gone into the woods alone before. I always stayed on the roads where other people were around. My grandma told me that workers had recently cleared an old path that had been blocked by bushes and trees for 30 years. They cleared it because a race was being planned for runners in the area. Now, normally when I went to the nearest town, which is about an hour's walk away, I would take the road I knew well. Then one day, after spending time with my friends in town, I decided to take the new path my grandma mentioned. She said it was safe to walk alone, and I was curious to see it. The path looked neat, with the bushes cleared, making it easy to follow. At first I thought it would be a fun shortcut, and something different from my usual walk. But looking back, taking that path was a really big mistake. The first part of the path was easy, even though there were a lot of obstacles and small landslides. But that was nothing compared to what came next. The second part was a steep hill covered in rocks, and it was really hard to climb. I had to use my hands and feet, almost like a dog, to get to the top. When I finally reached the top, I saw some animal bones lying around. I didn't think much about it, because this area is known for having lots of wolves and bears that come out at night. I started walking faster after that, feeling a bit uneasy. This part of the path was flat and easier to walk on, and it marked the start of the thick forest. For a moment, I felt relieved, because it seemed like the hard part was over. But then, I came to a sudden dead end. Huge trees had fallen across the path, perfectly lined up, blocking the way completely. There was no way to climb over or go around them. It felt odd, because there weren't any other fallen trees nearby, just these, as if they had been placed there on purpose. Right beside the fallen trees, I saw a small barn. It looked old and worn, standing in the middle of the forest, far from any houses or farms. Seeing a barn there, in such an isolated place, gave me an uneasy feeling. It didn't make sense for it to be there, so I thought the barn was probably abandoned. I decided to throw my bag into the small field next to the barn, and then climbed over the fence. I crossed the fence quickly, without noticing something very strange at first. The field had no trees, no bushes, and no big plants, just open, clear ground. It didn't make sense. If the barn was abandoned, the field should have been overgrown. Then I thought about how the fallen trees were in such a perfect line, almost too perfect. The fact that there was a barn right next to them and a field with no trees or plants seemed also really strange, especially since the path had been closed for 30 years. It didn't make sense, and it felt like something was off. After a while, I saw the last hill my grandma had described. It was the one that would lead me back to the village, and I felt relieved knowing I was almost there. The hill was familiar, and I knew that once I climbed it, I would be back in the safety of the village. But even as I walked toward it, the strange feeling stayed with me. Then, suddenly the forest went completely quiet, and I heard some branches cracking behind me. At first I told myself it was probably just a bird or some small animal, but the noise kept getting closer. It wasn't the sound of an animal moving through the bushes. It sounded like real footsteps, like someone was following me. I tried to calm myself down and convince myself that it was just an animal. My heart was racing, and my legs felt like they were moving on their own. So I started walking faster. But to my horror, the footsteps got faster too, matching my pace. It was like whatever was behind me was keeping up with me, and that made me even more terrified. As soon as I realized the footsteps were still following me, I started running. The footsteps kept up with me, and I was running for my life. Then I suddenly heard very loud grunts, and everything felt like it was happening too fast. But fortunately, I reached my village in just a minute or so, and I ran into the yard of the first house I found, which was my relative's house, and quickly closed the door behind me. I stayed at my relative's house for about 10 minutes, trying to calm down and catch my breath. I was shaking, and my heart was still racing from the fear. After I finally felt a little better, I left and made my way back home. Even now, just thinking about that place gives me chills. I can still remember the feeling of being completely alone in the woods, with no phone signal and no way to reach anyone. The loud grunts echo in my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that something was following me the whole time. The barn, the fallen trees, they were all part of something that made me slow down, to make sure I didn't get away. After that experience, I've never gone into the woods alone again, and I'm always much more careful when I'm out there. I'm not really someone who believes in the paranormal, but I've had a few weird experiences while hunting or hiking that I just can't explain. The most unsettling one happened about 7 or 8 years ago. I usually hunted on my family's land, a quiet area I knew well, surrounded by woods and open fields. But for some reason, though, I decided to try hunting on public land that day. Maybe I wanted to explore something different, or just see a new place. The public land was much larger, with thick trees and trails that felt unfamiliar. It was peaceful at first, but something about it felt off as the day went on. It was evening in the fall, but the day was unusually warm for that time of year. I drove to the access road and stopped at the usual spot, where people park before walking in. I noticed a couple of older men were already there. At first, nothing seemed strange about them, but then I realized there wasn't any truck or car they could have arrived in. They were wearing hunter orange, which stood out, so it seemed a little odd. But I figured they were probably just backpackers or campers. There's a campground not too far from that spot, and lots of people use it to get away for the weekend. So it's not unusual for someone to take a break from their family and enjoy some quiet time in the woods, even if they aren't hunting. Maybe they were just there to hike or relax before heading back to the campground. Anyway, they seemed friendly, and there was nothing unusual about them. They were just like many other hunters I've met before, probably a couple of country guys from the way they talked. We chatted for a few minutes, then they headed off into the woods. I stayed in my truck for a while, scrolling on my phone to give them a head start. I didn't want them to scare away the squirrels, but I guess I didn't wait long enough. About 10 minutes up the trail, it curved to the left, but I heard noises coming from straight ahead. The sound caught my attention because it was louder than a squirrel. I enjoy spotting animals whenever I'm out, so I decided to take a closer look. The noise didn't seem far from the main path, so I carefully stepped off the trail to check it out. As I moved further, the ground started to slope downward, giving me a better view. That's when I spotted the two guys again, but something about their behavior felt off. This is hard to explain without showing it, but they weren't moving like normal people. Their movements were strange and jerky, like they didn't know how to bend their knees or other joints properly. It was honestly so scary that I didn't stay there for long. I slowly and quietly backed away to the trail, trying not to make any noise. Then I ran back to my car as fast as I could. My heart was racing the whole time. After that, I talked to a few open-minded outdoorsmen in the area, people who are usually willing to listen to strange stories. But none of them had ever heard of anything like what I saw. I also did some searching online over the years, hoping to find something similar. But no matter how much I looked, I couldn't find any reports or stories that sounded like what I experienced. I live in Florida, in the countryside, and around my home, there are about 500 acres of woods filled with tall trees and thick bushes. There are open spaces here and there, where you can find other houses and fields with cows grazing. Our home is close to the main road, but it's far enough back that we don't hear cars or trucks passing by. The drive to the nearest store takes about 15 minutes, so we usually stock up on things when we go. Our yard is about 5 acres, and we often see wild turkeys, armadillos, coyotes, and of course, deer. Our land used to be an old grape farm, so there are many small ridges in the ground where grapes were grown. A herd of about 7 to 13 deer, including mothers and their babies, often rest in these ridges. In the mornings, they like to eat the gardenia flowers in our yard. We usually leave the deer alone and keep our dogs and chickens inside until they leave. A few months ago, I started waking up early to enjoy my coffee on the back porch. I liked watching the deer move around the yard. They are most active at sunrise, stretching and walking around after waking up. And over time, I noticed one deer that seemed different. It often stood still and stared at the house with full attention, almost as if it was trying to figure something out. But it wasn't scared or in a hurry like the others. Even when I wasn't outside, I would look through the window and see it standing there, watching the house. It felt a bit strange, but I couldn't tell why it acted that way. I would sit in our computer room at the back of the house and feel like something was watching me. When I looked out the window, I'd see that same deer staring straight at the house. It didn't look with just one eye, but used both, almost like it was looking down its nose at us. My mom noticed it too, and it made us feel uneasy. Then one morning, I thought the deer had left, so I let my dog outside. My dog is big and black, but very gentle, and he often loves to chase birds and deer. But if they don't run, he loses interest because they're not playing with him. Now, our chickens are used to him and usually don't pay attention, often sticking close to our small livestock dog for safety. Now that morning, when I let him out, he immediately spotted the deer and bolted toward them. But suddenly, about 100 feet from the deer, he froze in place. His tail dropped, and he tucked it between his legs. So I followed his gaze and saw the odd deer again, the one that always stared at the house. It was watching him closely, its head slightly tilted and its nose pointed directly at him. The way it stared felt really weird, almost like it wasn't afraid, but was challenging him instead. My dog, who usually never backs down, turned and slowly walked back toward the house. I called my dog back and he ran to me, hiding behind my legs like he was scared. I looked at the deer and it turned to stare at me. That's when I noticed something wasn't right. It didn't look like a normal deer. Its eyes seemed too big for its head, and its body looked a little off, like the parts didn't fit together properly. At first glance, it seemed like a real deer, but the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. I've seen plenty of deer before, and this one just didn't look right. It was like something was pretending to be a deer, as if it had put on a deer's skin, but it didn't fit properly. The whole thing gave me an uneasy feeling. We started a new habit of closing the blinds in the morning and waiting until the sun was higher in the sky before letting the dogs outside. After a while, construction began on the land next to us, which was sold. It was about 100 acres of land being cleared. Since then, we haven't seen any deer, and I think that's for the best.